They asked humanity to choose one world to save. Earth saved none. The alarm reached the conquered council 7 hours before it reached the public. By then, 3 star systems were already dying. The event had no clean name yet. Some called it the Gray Tide. Others called it the Hollowing because that was what it did to a system. It hollowed it out, star and planets and moons, turning matter into a spreading gray static that ate light and gave nothing back. It moved slower than a fleet but faster than any evacuation plan drawn up in peacetime. Scientists across a dozen species argued about where it came from. Nobody argued about where it was going. 3 inhabited worlds sat in its path. Vesa Prime, home to nearly 6 billion Vesari, a species of tall, patient beings who had built cities that curved like seashells, and who had never fought a war in their recorded history. Keithrani Hollow, a moon world of the Keithran Assembly, home to 2 billion, mostly miners and engineers, a hard people who had carved their homes out of rock and pride. And Old Saren, the ancestral homeworld of the Sereni, a species that had lost 2 other colonies to war a century ago and had exactly 1 world left that they called home. The conquered council convened in emergency session in the orbital city of Threna Station, a wheel of light hanging above a neutral world that belonged to no single species. Delegates arrived in a hurry, some still in their sleep clothes, robes thrown over travel suits, faces tired and afraid. The council hall was a wide circular room with a floor made of dark glass that showed the stars beneath it, so that every delegate always felt like they were standing over open space. Today, nobody looked down. At the center of the hall stood High Speaker Dorothy Can, an old Vesari woman with silver skin and eyes like still water. She did not waste time on formal greetings. 3 worlds, she said, and her voice carried without a microphone, the way old speakers' voices always seemed to. 3 worlds, and the tide will reach all of them within 40 days. We do not have the ships to save all 3. We do not have the ships to save 2. Every fleet in the conquered, combined, has enough capacity to fully evacuate 1 world in that time. 1. A murmur ran through the hall, not of surprise, but of grief already beginning. We have asked every major power in the conquered to bring their fleets and their engineers here to this hall so that we may decide together which world we can save. This is not a happy task. It is the only task in front of us. The delegates from a dozen species sat in their tiered seats around the room, and one by one, their fleet numbers were read aloud. The Vesari Compact could evacuate perhaps 400,000 of their own people, no more, since so much of their fleet was already tied down defending their border. The Keithran Assembly, proud and stubborn, offered ships enough to save maybe 600,000. The Sereni, still rebuilding from war, could offer almost nothing beyond a handful of transport ships. Then the speaker's eyes moved to a delegation that had arrived only 9 months earlier as full members of the conquered, a species still considered new, still considered unproven by many in the room. Humanity, she said, you bring the newest fleet among us and by some measures among the fastest. We have not asked lightly. We ask now, which world will you help us save? All eyes turned toward the human delegation. At the head of that delegation sat Fleet Commander Elias Akafar, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with gray at his temples, and a calm, careful way of looking at people before he spoke. Beside him sat Dr. Amara Singh, chief engineer of the Terran Deep Systems Fleet, and a young translator named Marcus Bellwether, who had spent the last 2 years learning to read the small movements in alien faces that most humans never noticed. Akafar did not stand right away. He looked around the hall first, at the tired, grieving faces of a dozen species, at the empty seats where the Sereni delegation sat with almost nothing to offer and everything to lose. Then he rose. High Speaker, he said, with respect, before we answer that question, we would ask for time, 3 days. Not to decide which world to abandon, 3 days to see if there is another way. The hall went quiet in a different way now, a sharper silence. Speaker Khan studied him for a long moment. Commander Akafar, the tide does not wait for hope. Every hour spent searching for another way is an hour not spent evacuating the world you do choose. I understand that, HFY said. I'm not asking you to stop your own evacuation planning. Please, continue exactly as you are. I am only asking that humanity not answer your question yet. Give us 3 days before you ask us again. There were objections. The Kithran delegate, a broad, gray-skinned man named Director V. Horn, stood and said bluntly that hope was a luxury they could not afford, that 3 days of Terran hesitation might cost the very world they eventually chose to save. Others agreed. But there were also a few, quieter voices that pointed out humanity had asked for very little in 9 months of membership, and had given more than expected more than once. In the end, Speaker Khan granted the 3 days, though her eyes stayed on HFY with something between doubt and a strange, cautious curiosity. 3 days, Commander, she said. Do not waste them. When the human delegation left the council hall, they did not speak until they reached their transport shuttle. Only then did Amara Singh turn to HFY, her jaw tight. You just bought us 3 days to solve an impossible problem, she said. Elias, tell me you have something. I don't, HFY admitted, but I have a feeling and I have you. That's usually been enough before. Back on Earth, in a research complex buried beneath the mountains outside what had once been called Geneva, the message reached a project that very few people outside a small circle even knew existed. It was called, in typical human fashion, something dry and unremarkable on paper, Project Threadwork. But the people who worked on it called it something else quietly among themselves. They called it the Bridge. Dr. Naomi Reyes had spent 11 years of her life on it, ever since a strange discovery in a lab studying quantum entanglement had shown that under very specific conditions, entangled particles did not merely share information across distance. They shared position. Not perfectly, not stably, but under the right conditions with enough energy and enough precision, matter itself could be made to behave like information, and information could be moved. It was not a wormhole. It was not the folding of space the way old human science fiction had imagined it. It was something stranger, and until recently, something useless, because it required an amount of energy that no single fusion reactor could provide, and it could only move very small amounts of matter, and only for a few seconds before the connection collapsed. But 11 years was a long time. And 9 months ago, when humanity joined the Conquered and gained access to Conquered-grade fusion technology far beyond anything Earth had built alone, everything about Project Threadwork's math had changed. The call from Fleet Command reached Naomi at 2 in the morning her time. She listened for 4 minutes without saying a word, and then she said only, "Yes, I think we can. But I need every ship humanity has that's fitted with a Conquered reactor, and I need them in position in 3 days, and I need to know exactly how many people we're moving and where they are." On the other end of the call, HFY allowed himself, for the first time in 9 hours, something close to a smile. "Dr. Reyes," he said, "how many people can Threadwork move if we push it as far as it will go?" There was a pause. Naomi was doing math in her head, math she had done 1,000 times in theory and never once in practice at this scale. "I don't know the ceiling," she said honestly. "I know the failure state. If we push it too hard, the connection collapses mid-transfer and whatever's being moved doesn't arrive. It doesn't die. It doesn't survive either. It just stops existing in either place." "That's not an answer I can bring to the council," HFY said. "I know," Naomi said. "Give me the 3 days, I'll have a better one." Back on Threna Station, word of the human request spread quickly through the diplomatic corridors, and not kindly. Many delegates saw it as arrogance, a new species barely a year into Conquered membership acting as though it might succeed where the combined engineering of a dozen older civilizations had failed. Some saw it as an insult to the Serenai, whose delegation sat through every session with the quiet, terrible dignity of people who had already begun preparing themselves to lose everything. Serenai Ambassador Thessaly Kaur, a slight woman with dark, deep-set eyes, approached the human quarters on the second day, alone, without an escort. Marcus Bellwether met her at the door, surprised. "I would like to speak with your commander," she said. Akafar received her in a small meeting room with a single window that looked out over the curve of the station, and beyond it, the dark scatter of stars. Thessaly Kor sat very straight, her hands folded in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. "My world has 300 years of memory in it," she finally said. "Cities that remember wars we should have lost. Libraries older than your species' recorded history, Commander Akafar. I do not say this to guilt you. I say it because I want you to understand what a delay costs if it comes to nothing." "I understand," Akafar said quietly. "Do you?" Her eyes were steady, not accusing, only searching. "Or are you gambling with worlds that are not your own, Commander, because your species has not yet learned what it means to lose one?" The question landed hard, and Akafar did not answer quickly. He thought of the wars Earth had fought against itself, the cities his own grandfather had watched fall in a war 200 years before humanity ever looked up and found the stars were not empty. He thought of how young the peace on Earth still was, how many of its people still remembered, in their bones if not their memories, what it meant to watch something irreplaceable burn. "We have lost things," he said finally. "Not a whole world, not yet, but enough to know we don't want to choose which of your peoples gets to keep theirs. Ambassador, I am not asking you to trust hope. I am asking you to trust 3 more days. If we fail, I promise you, humanity's full fleet goes wherever the Council decides without hesitation, without another word of protest from us. But if there's a chance to save more than one world, I think your people, more than anyone in that hall, understand why it's worth 3 days to look for it." Thessaly Kor studied him for a long time before she rose to leave. At the door she paused. 300 years of memory, Commander," she said. "I hope your 3 days are worth it." That night on Earth, the first full test of the expanded threadwork system took place in the vacuum above the Terran shipyards at Ceres, watched by a small, exhausted team who had not slept in 2 days. They were not moving people, not yet. They were moving a single unmanned transport pod, empty, across 400,000 kilometers of open space. In an instant, using the combined output of 6 Concord-grade reactors linked to a resonance array that Naomi Reyes had built and rebuilt 11 times in 11 years. The pod vanished from one point in space. 2.1 seconds later, it appeared at the other, intact, its internal systems reporting a flawless transfer. In the control room, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then someone began to laugh, and then several people were crying, and Naomi Reyes sat very still in her chair, staring at the readout, thinking not of the 11 years behind her, but of the 40 days ahead and how far this was still from being enough. She reached for her comm unit and called Fleet Command. "Commander Akafar," she said when the channel connected, her voice shaking only slightly. "Tell the Council humanity has an answer. Tell them we're not choosing one world." There was a silence on the other end, and then Akafar's voice, careful, cautious, hopeful in a way he had not allowed himself to be in days. "Tell me you can do all 3, Naomi." "I can't promise all 3, she said. "Not yet. I can promise we're going to try for all 3. And Elias, if it works, we're not saving 3 worlds. We're going to lose all 3 worlds to the tide. Nothing stops that. But we might be able to save every single person standing on them." On Threna Station, the 3rd day arrived, and the council hall filled once more, delegates tired, tempers thin, the countdown to the tide's arrival now etched into the corner of every screen in the room. High Speaker Dorothy Cann called the session to order and turned once more to the human delegation. "Commander Akafar," she said, "your 3 days are finished. The Council must have your answer. Which world does humanity choose to save?" Elias Akafar rose to his feet, and every eye in the hall, human and alien alike, turned toward him. "High Speaker," he said, "humanity does not choose." The hall erupted into noise, but Akafar raised his voice over it, steady and clear. "We are not choosing one world to save," he said, "because we don't believe we have to. We believe we can save every person on every one of those 3 worlds, not the ground beneath their feet, not their cities, not their skies. Those, I am sorry to say, we cannot save from the tide. Nothing can, but the people themselves, all of them, we believe we can carry somewhere safe. If the Council will trust us, and if every fleet in this room will help us, humanity intends to save no world at all, and every single life standing on them. For a long moment, the council hall was utterly silent, 12 species staring at one new, stubborn, unproven people who had just promised the impossible, with 40 days left to prove it true. The silence in the council hall broke into chaos. Director V. Horn of the Keythron Assembly was on his feet first, his broad gray face twisted with disbelief. You want us to gamble 8 billion lives on an experiment your own species has never tested at scale? Commander Akafer, do you understand what you are asking? I understand exactly what I'm asking, Akafer said, standing firm. I'm asking you to let us try to save people your own fleets cannot save in time. If we succeed, you lose nothing you would not have already lost. If we fail, you have lost 3 days of preparation, which we will make up for with every ship and every hand humanity has to offer. And if your device kills the very people it is meant to save, V. Horn snapped. What then, Commander? Do you have an apology large enough for that? Amara Singh stood beside Akafer, her voice sharp and clear enough to cut through the noise. The technology does not kill. It either works or the connection fails before it completes and nothing happens. Nobody arrives broken. Nobody arrives hurt. Either they arrive whole, or the transfer simply doesn't happen, and they remain exactly where they started, safe until the next attempt. That was not entirely true, and both Akafer and Singh knew it. There was a third possibility, the one Naomi Reyes had described in the middle of the night 3 days before. The failure state where a connection collapsed mid-transfer, and whatever was being moved simply stopped existing in either place. But that had never happened in 11 years of testing, not once the resonance array was properly tuned, and Naomi's team had spent every hour of the last 3 days tuning it as precisely as human hands and human science could manage. Akafer made the choice, standing there in that hall, not to mention a risk that existed only in theory, and that his own engineers considered vanishingly small. He would carry that choice, whatever came of it. High Speaker Khan raised a hand, and slowly the noise in the hall subsided. Commander Akafer, she said, you ask this council to trust an experimental system, tested only in empty space with no living being to move the population of 3 worlds. Explain to us in plain terms exactly what you intend to do and how. Akafer nodded to Amara Singh, who stepped forward and activated a small holographic display above the central podium. It showed a simple diagram, 2 points in space, connected by a thin, glowing thread of light. This is what we call the threadwork system, she explained. It does not open a doorway or a tunnel through space the way some of your own long-range transit technologies do. Instead, it uses entangled particles to make matter in one location share its exact position with matter in another location for a fraction of a second. In that fraction of a second, whatever occupies the first location effectively becomes what occupies the second. It moves instantly. There is no ship crossing the distance. There is no risk of interception, no risk of debris, no risk of the terrible speeds needed for any kind of physical travel across such distances in so little time. And the range? Asked a delegate from the small, insect-like Aetheri species, who had said nothing until now. Currently tested and confirmed to just over 400,000 kilometers, Singh said. Vesa Prime, Keithrani Hollow, and Old Sarin are all within range of relay platforms we can deploy in time, if we begin immediately. And the capacity, V. Horn demanded. How many people, Commander, can you move with this thread of yours in the time we have? This was the question Akafer had been dreading, because the honest answer was still, even now, an estimate. With every reactor humanity currently has fitted for Concord-grade output, linked together in a resonance network, and with continuous operation for the full 40 days, our engineers estimate we can move approximately 9 million people per day, once the system reaches full efficiency. It will not reach full efficiency immediately. The first several days will be slower, as we calibrate for each individual world's gravitational and atmospheric conditions. The hall did the math almost as one. 9 million a day for 40 days was 360 million, a number that sounded enormous until it was measured against 6 billion Vesari, 2 billion Kithrin, and however many millions of Serenai remained on their one surviving world. "That is not enough," Ambassador Thessaly Kor said quietly, the first words she had spoken since the session began. All eyes turned to her. "Even if your numbers are correct, Commander, you cannot move 6 billion Vesari in 40 days at that rate. You cannot move all 3 worlds combined. This is not salvation. It is a slower version of exactly the same choice you were already asked to make." Akafur did not flinch from her gaze. "You're right, Ambassador. 9 million a day working alone is not enough. That's why we're not asking to work alone." He turned to the assembled delegates. "Every fleet in this Concord has ships capable of atmospheric evacuation, of moving people to orbit, of sorting and organizing millions of civilians in short amounts of time. What none of you have is a way to move them across 400,000 kilometers in an instant safely, without the enormous fuel and time costs of conventional travel. We are not asking you to abandon your own evacuation plans. We are asking you to feed them into ours. Let your ships gather your people to relay points in orbit. Let Threadwork carry them the rest of the way to safe systems, in a fraction of the time your own fleets would need to make that same journey physically. Combined, your evacuation capacity and our transfer capacity, we believe we can save far more than 360 million people. We believe, if every power in this room commits fully, we can save nearly everyone." For a long moment nobody spoke. Then V-Horn, still frowning, still doubtful, asked the question that mattered most. "Nearly everyone, not everyone." "No," Akafur admitted. "Not everyone. I won't stand here and promise you a miracle with no cost. Some worlds have people too old, too sick, too remote to reach in time, no matter what system we use. Some regions may simply run out of time before evacuation reaches them. I am not promising perfection. I am promising more than the alternative on the table today, which is that 2 entire species lose everyone, and one loses nothing, decided by a vote in this room." Thessaly Kor was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes moving between Akafur and the holographic display still glowing above the podium. Finally, she spoke. "The Serenai fleet is small," she said. "We cannot offer you much in ships, but we can offer you every engineer, every technician, every able body we have, if it means my people are not simply written off because our numbers were the smallest and our world the least defensible." "No one is being written off, Ambassador," Akafur said quietly. "That's the entire point." Slowly, painfully, the hall began to shift. It was not unanimous and it was not immediate. Some delegates, like V-Horn, remained skeptical for hours, demanding technical specifications, demanding guarantees that Akafur could not honestly give. Others, particularly the smaller species with the least to offer in fleet power, saw in the plan the first hope they had been given since the crisis began, and pushed hard for the Council to commit. It was Speaker Khan, in the end, who tipped the balance not with authority, but with a question aimed directly at Akafur, in front of the entire hall. "Commander," she said, "if this Council commits every ship, every hand, every resource we have to your plan, and it still is not enough, if, at the end of 40 days, we have saved less than we would have saved by choosing one world outright and evacuating it fully, will your species accept the consequences of that failure, knowing it was your own delegation that asked us to gamble everything on it?" Akafur met her eyes without hesitation. "Yes," he said, "every consequence, every loss will be one my people carry alongside yours for as long as it takes to make it right, however that's possible. High Speaker, I'm not asking you to trust that we're certain to succeed. I'm asking you to let us try, because the alternative in front of us right now guarantees failure for 2 out of 3 worlds, and I don't believe any of us in this room actually wants that outcome if there's any other path." The vote, when it finally came, was not close. 11 votes in favor, 1 abstention from the Kithrin Assembly, whose delegate V-horn still voiced doubt even as he cast it, saying only that he hoped, for the sake of 2 billion of his own people, that human confidence was matched by human competence. The conquered council committed itself fully to what would soon be called across a dozen worlds the Threadwork Evacuation, though the humans who built it, tired and afraid in the weeks that followed, mostly just called it the bridge, the way they always had. The work that followed was unlike anything the conquered had attempted before. Within 6 hours of the vote, Terran engineers were transmitting technical specifications to a coalition of species who had, until 9 months ago, considered humanity a curiosity at best. Kithran shipyards, the finest fabricators in known conquered space, began producing relay platform components around the clock, working from Terran designs they did not fully understand but trusted enough to build exactly as instructed. Vesari orbital cities, evacuated of non-essential personnel, were repurposed as staging grounds. Even the Aetheri, a species that rarely committed openly to anything, quietly offered their long-range sensor networks to help track the tide's advance with more precision than the conquered had managed alone. Naomi Reyes barely slept in the days that followed. She oversaw the deployment of the first relay platforms herself, 3 of them, positioned in high orbit above Vesa Prime, Keithrani Hollow, and Old Saren, each one a squat, ugly structure bristling with the largest resonance arrays humanity had ever built, each one drawing power from 6 linked Conquered-grade reactors donated, at Akhafer's request, from 3 different species fleets. The first live test with actual volunteers took place 9 days after the Council's vote, on Old Saren, chosen because the Sereni had the least to lose in numbers and the most to gain in hope. 12 volunteers, all adults, all fully informed of the risks, stood in a transfer chamber built to Terran and Sereni joint specifications, while Naomi Reyes and a Sereni engineer named Doran Vey watched the readouts together, neither one breathing. The transfer took 2.3 seconds. On the other end, 400,000 kilometers away, aboard a receiving station in a system untouched by the tide, 12 Sereni volunteers stepped out of the receiving chamber, disoriented, some in tears, all of them whole. Doran Vey turned to Naomi Reyes, his dark eyes wet, and said something in his own language that the translator struggled to render exactly, but that Marcus Bellwether, standing nearby, later said was closest in meaning to. "You have given my people a door where there was only a wall." Word spread fast after that. Across 3 worlds now facing the slow, silent approach of the tide, hope began to move as quickly as fear once had. But hope alone did not solve the hardest problem still ahead of them, not whether the bridge worked, because now they knew it did, but whether it could work fast enough for enough people, before the tide arrived and made the question meaningless. 40 days had become 31. And 360 million people was still, by every honest calculation Naomi Reyes could make, nowhere near enough. By day 15, the numbers told a story that frightened everyone who understood them. Naomi Reyes stood in the operations center built into the side of the largest relay platform above Vesa Prime, staring at a wall of screens showing transfer rates from all 3 worlds. 9 million a day had been the early estimate, and for the first week, they had not even reached that. Calibration problems, unexpected atmospheric interference above Keithrani Hollow, a software conflict between Terran control systems and Vesari orbital tracking that took 2 full days to resolve. Every small failure ate into time they did not have. By day 15, the combined transfer rate across all 3 relay networks had finally climbed to just over 11 million people per day, higher than the original estimate, thanks to efficiency improvements Naomi's team had made on the fly. It was still not enough. At that rate, over the 25 days remaining, they would move just under 300 million people. Combined, the 3 worlds held more than 8 billion. Elias Akhafer found Naomi in the operations center late that night, her eyes red-rimmed, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside her console. "Tell me something good," he said quietly. "The system works," she said. "That's good. It's more than good, Elias. It's a miracle, and I still can't quite believe we built it. But it's not enough, and you know it's not enough, and I don't have a way to make 11 million a day into 50 million a day. We're already running every reactor we have. We're already running the arrays past their rated limits. Then we need more reactors, HFY said. We need more reactors, more relay platforms, more orbital staging capacity, and about 100,000 more trained personnel to run evacuation logistics on the ground, on 3 different worlds, in 3 different languages, under 3 different governments who are all understandably panicking. Naomi rubbed her eyes. Elias, I've done everything I know how to do. I don't know where the rest comes from. It came, in the end, from an unexpected place. 2 days later, a small Kithran engineering delegation arrived at the Vesa Prime relay platform, led by a stocky, weathered woman named Chief Engineer Brana Talvek, who had spent 30 years designing mining equipment capable of surviving conditions that would kill most beings in minutes. She found Naomi Reyes in the operations center, and without much ceremony, spread a set of technical schematics across the nearest console. Your resonance arrays, Talvek said, her standard Concord speech thickly accented, are built for precision. Beautiful precision, wasteful precision. Naomi bristled slightly. They're precise because precision is what keeps people alive during transfer. I'm not saying remove the precision, Talvek said, unbothered. I am saying you built for elegance when you should build for volume. My people do not build elegant things, Dr. Reyes. We build things that work over and over without stopping, under conditions that would break elegant things in a day. Let me show you. What followed was 18 hours of argument, calculation, and reluctant collaboration between 2 engineering philosophies that had, until that week, never had reason to speak to each other. Naomi's precision-focused design could move individuals with near-perfect safety margins, but slowly, one careful calibration at a time. Kithran mining technology, adapted from decades of moving massive quantities of ore through automated tunnel systems, was built for raw throughput, for moving enormous volume continuously with far tighter margins for error. The solution, when it finally emerged near dawn, was neither purely Terran nor purely Kithran. Naomi called it, half-joking, the ugly array. A resonance configuration that sacrificed some of the individual transfer precision of the original threadwork design in exchange for the ability to move groups of up to 200 people simultaneously, in tightly synchronized clusters, rather than one at a time. The first full-scale test of the ugly array took place above Kithrani Hollow on day 19. 206 Kithran miners, evacuated from a deep settlement directly in the tide's projected path, stood together in an expanded transfer chamber built in less than 4 days by Talvek's own construction crews. Naomi Reyes watched the readouts beside Brana Talvek, both women silent, both gripping the edge of the console without realizing it. The transfer took 4.1 seconds. 206 Kithran miners stepped out of a receiving chamber on the far end, disoriented, coughing, a few of them laughing in the particular way people laugh when they cannot quite process that they are still alive. By day 20, the combined transfer rate across all 3 worlds had more than tripled, to just over 38 million people per day. It still was not enough, but for the first time since the crisis began, Naomi Reyes allowed herself to believe it might get there. The human-Kithran collaboration became something larger than either side had expected. Word of the ugly array spread quickly through the growing coalition of engineers and technicians now working around the clock across 3 worlds, and other species began contributing their own specialties in turn. Vesari orbital logistics experts, whose species had spent centuries perfecting the peaceful, careful movement of enormous urban populations during natural disasters, redesigned the ground-side staging process, cutting the time it took to move a group of evacuees from a city center to a relay platform's transfer chamber from 6 hours to under 90 minutes. Etheri sensor specialists, working with Terran physicists, found a way to predict micro-fluctuations in the tide's approach with enough precision to safely extend evacuation windows in certain regions by as much as 30 hours, buying critical extra time for the slowest-moving evacuation zones. It was not smooth, it was not without cost. On day 23, a coordination failure between Vesari ground control and a Terran relay platform resulted in a transfer group of 140 Vesari civilians being left waiting at a staging point for 6 hours past their scheduled window. During a period when local weather conditions on the ground had begun to shift unpredictably due to the tide's growing gravitational influence on the upper atmosphere. All 140 were eventually evacuated safely, but the near miss shook everyone involved, and Elias Akafer personally flew down to the staging site afterward, not to assign blame, but simply to stand with the exhausted ground crew and thank them for not losing a single person despite the chaos. On Old Saren, the smallest and least defended of the three worlds, a different kind of difficulty emerged. The Sarenai population, still bearing the psychological weight of 2 lost colonies from the war a century before, struggled in places with something no amount of engineering could fix: the fear of loss itself. Entire communities, particularly in older, rural regions, resisted evacuation, unwilling to leave behind homes and land and the graves of ancestors, even knowing what remaining meant. Ambassador Thessaly Kor took it upon herself to travel personally to the most resistant regions, standing in village squares and old temple courtyards, speaking not as a diplomat but as a daughter of Old Saren herself. "I do not ask you to stop grieving," she told one gathering, recorded and later shared across the evacuation network as a kind of quiet rallying point for exhausted workers everywhere. "I do not ask you to forget this ground, or these stones, or the names carved into them. I ask only that you carry your grief somewhere it can still breathe, instead of leaving it here to be erased along with everything else. Let the tide take the ground. It cannot take you unless you let it." Slowly, region by region, resistance softened. It did not disappear entirely. Some elderly Sarenai in the end chose to remain on their world rather than leave it, a choice the Council, after long and difficult debate, ultimately decided to respect rather than force. But the overwhelming majority of Old Saren's population, by day 25, had either already transferred or were scheduled within the evacuation window. By day 30, the combined daily transfer rate across all three worlds had climbed to 52 million people, a number that would have sounded impossible to every person in that council hall 30 days before. Naomi Reyes, running on too little sleep and too much coffee, finally allowed herself to run the full projection forward to day 40, the day the tide was expected to reach the innermost of the 3 threatened systems. She sat with the number for a long time before she called Akafer. "Elias," she said when he answered, her voice thin with exhaustion and something that might have been hope, might have been fear of hoping too soon. "If nothing else goes wrong, if we hold this rate, if nothing else breaks, we're going to get almost everyone. Not everyone, but almost everyone, Elias, all 3 worlds." There was a long silence on the line. "How almost?" Akafer asked finally. 94%, Naomi said. "Best projection. 94% of 8,300,000,000 people." Akafer did the math in his head, the way he had learned to do without wanting to. Over 30 days of watching numbers become names, became faces, became people he had personally met on staging platforms across 3 worlds. 6% was still nearly 500 million people. The models projected they might not reach in time. "We keep pushing," he said quietly. "Every day we can shave off, every percent we can gain, we take it. We don't stop pushing until the tide is on top of us and not 1 second before." "I know," Naomi said. "I wasn't calling to tell you to stop, Elias. I was calling because I needed to say it out loud to someone before I said it to the council tomorrow. We might actually do this." 10 days remained. 10 days, and a number that had gone, in 30 days of desperate, unglamorous, exhausting work by a dozen species who had never before trusted each other enough to build anything together, from an impossible 0 to a devastating, hopeful 94. The last 10 days did not go smoothly. Nothing about the last 10 days went smoothly. On day 32, the tide's advance accelerated without warning. Etheri sensor teams, who had spent weeks building a reliable model of its approach, watched in alarm as the leading edge of the gray static surged forward nearly 11% faster than projected, swallowing an uninhabited outer moon of the Keithrani Hollow system 2 full days ahead of schedule. It was not catastrophic on its own. No people lived on that moon. But it meant the safety margin everyone had been quietly relying on had just shrunk, and shrunk badly. Ilya's Akafor called an emergency session with the operations leads from all 3 evacuation zones, gathering them in a shared comm channel that connected Naomi Reyes above Vesa Prime, Brana Talvek above Keithrani Hollow, and Doran Vey, now leading ground coordination on Old Saren. "We don't have 10 days anymore," Akafor said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Best estimate is 8, maybe 7 if the acceleration continues. I need honest numbers from each of you. What does that cost us?" The silence that followed was heavy. Naomi ran the projection first, her fingers moving fast across her console, her face pale in the low light of the operations center. "At current rates, losing 2 to 3 days pushes our final coverage down to somewhere between 86 and 88%, she said. That's a lot of people, Elias. That's potentially an extra 600,000 to 1,000,000 people we don't reach in time." Talvek's voice came through next, rough but steady. "Keithrani Hollow can push the ugly arrays another 15% past rated output. I do not promise you they survive it. I promise you they will not fail quietly. If they go loud, and they take the transfer chamber with them." "How loud?" Akafor asked. "Loud enough that anyone inside does not walk away," Talvek said bluntly. "I will not push past that line without your order, Commander, and I will not lie to you about the risk to make it easier to give." Akafor closed his eyes for a moment. Around him, in the operations center on Vesa Prime, the low hum of the relay arrays continued, steady and indifferent to the weight of the decision being made a few meters away. "Push it to 12%, he said finally, "not 15. 12, and I want redundant safety cutoffs on every chamber, manual and automatic, and I want your best people, not your fastest people, running the controls. We are not trading speed for lives. We're trying to buy both as carefully as we can." Doran Vey spoke next, his voice tight. "Old Saren's problem is not throughput. It is geography. We have 3 remaining regions, mountain communities, difficult to reach by ground transport in the time we now have. If we lose 2 days, we may not physically move enough people to staging platforms in time, regardless of how fast the arrays themselves can work." "Then we go to them," Akafor said. "Amara, are the mobile relay units ready?" Amara Singh's voice cut in from a separate line, where she had been monitoring the conversation from a Terran shuttle in transit between platforms. 2 of the 4 mobile units are field-ready. The other 2 need another 18 hours of calibration minimum. "Get them ready in 12, Akafor said. "I don't care what it takes. Doran, the moment the first mobile unit is operational, I want it in the highest risk mountain region. We take the bridge to the people who can't reach the bridge." It was, in the days that followed, one of the more remarkable improvisations of the entire evacuation. 2 truck-sized mobile relay units, hastily adapted from Terran orbital designs by a joint Terran-Sarenai engineering team working nearly without sleep, transported by aging Sarenai cargo haulers into mountain valleys that had never in their history seen technology like it. In one such valley, an elderly Sarenai farmer named Ilith Corvain, who had refused evacuation for 11 days despite Ambassador Corps' personal visits, watched a mobile relay unit hum to life in the middle of what had once been his family's grazing field, and finally, quietly, allowed his grandchildren to be moved first, then followed himself an hour later, carrying nothing but a small wooden box of old photographs. By day 35, 5 days before the tide's revised arrival at the innermost system, the combined evacuation had regained much of its lost ground. The pushed arrays above Keithrani Hollow held, though 2 of the 12 chambers required emergency shutdown and repair after showing dangerous thermal readings, a decision Talvek made without hesitation the moment her instruments gave her cause for concern, even though it cost nearly 6 hours of lost transfer time. Nobody was hurt. She reported the near failure to HFY personally, her voice flat with exhaustion. "I told you it might go loud," she said. "It did not go loud. It went close to loud. I am telling you now so you know the margin we are working with, Commander. It is thinner than either of us would like." "Understood," HFY said. "Thank you for shutting it down before it mattered more than the numbers." The hardest day in the end was day 38, 2 days before the tide reached Old Sarin, the innermost and first threatened of the 3 worlds. At 3:40 station time, a transfer failure occurred in one of the Vesa Prime relay chambers, the first true failure of the entire operation. A group of 183 Vesari civilians, mostly families with young children, had entered the chamber for transfer when a power fluctuation in one of the linked reactors caused the resonance field to destabilize mid-cycle. Naomi Reyes was not in the operations center when it happened. She had been asleep for the first time in 19 hours, and the emergency alert woke her so violently that she was on her feet and running before she had fully processed what the alert meant. By the time she reached the control room, the on-duty engineer, a young Vesari technician named Sela Rennick, had already executed the emergency abort protocol, the one built specifically for this exact failure mode, the one that Naomi herself had insisted on building into the system from the very first day of testing, over the objections of engineers who called it an unnecessary redundancy. The abort protocol worked exactly as designed. The transfer field collapsed safely, and all 183 people remained exactly where they had started, in the chamber on Vesa Prime, shaken, frightened, but entirely unharmed. Naomi Reyes stood in the control room afterward, staring at the readouts, her hands shaking, thinking of the theoretical failure state she had described to HFY on the very first night of this entire effort, the one where a collapsed connection meant something simply stopped existing in either place. It had not happened. The redundancy had worked. But for the first time since the project began, it had come close enough that she could not pretend the risk was purely theoretical anymore. She found Sela Rennick afterward, sitting alone in a corridor outside the control room, still trembling. "You did exactly the right thing," Naomi told her, sitting down beside her on the floor, too tired to stand any longer herself. "You saved 183 people because you trusted the protocol instead of panicking. That's not a small thing, that's the whole thing." "I was so afraid," Sela admitted quietly. "So was I," Naomi said. "I've been afraid since the day this started. I think that's the only reason any of this has worked. We were all too afraid to get complacent." The chamber was repaired within 6 hours, the reactor fault identified and corrected, and the evacuation resumed. The 183 civilians who had survived the failed transfer were given priority placement in the next transfer cycle, and this time it succeeded without incident. Word of the near disaster spread quickly, and for a brief, dangerous period, panic threatened to spread with it. Crowds at several staging points on Vesa Prime grew fearful, reluctant to enter transfer chambers, murmuring that the human technology had failed once and might fail again. It was, in the end, Speaker Dorothy Cann herself who addressed the fear directly, appearing in a broadcast scene across all 3 evacuation zones, standing beside Naomi Reyes and Elias HFY. "I will not tell you there is no risk," the old Vesari woman said, her voice steady despite her own visible exhaustion. "There is risk in everything worth doing, and there was certainly risk in this. But I will tell you what I saw with my own eyes in the reports from this morning. When the system detected danger, it stopped itself, exactly as it was built to do, and every single person in that chamber walked out unharmed. That is not failure. That is a system working precisely as its makers intended, even in the worst moment it has yet faced. I have watched these people, Human and Vesari and Keithrin and Serenai together, work themselves past exhaustion for 38 days to build something that could save us. I choose to trust them for the 2 days that remain. I ask you to trust them too." The panic did not vanish entirely, but it eased, and the evacuation continued. By the evening of day 39, With less than 18 hours remaining before the tide's leading edge reached Old Sarin, the final numbers began to come in. Old Sarin's population, once 11 million strong, had been reduced by evacuation to fewer than 400,000 remaining on the surface, most of them in the final staging queues, moving through the last operational relay chambers as quickly as the system could manage. Keithrani Hollow, further out and granted a slightly longer window, had moved all but roughly 1.1 million of its 2 billion people, with mobile units and pushed arrays working at their absolute limits to close the remaining gap. Vesa Prime, the largest and most distant of the three, still had the most people remaining, nearly 300 million out of its original 6 billion, though its evacuation window remained open for 3 more days yet. Elias Akafer stood in the operations center above Old Sarin itself in the final hours, having flown down personally to be present at the last transfers, standing beside Doran Vey and Ambassador Thessaly Kor as the final staging queue on the world's surface thinned to a trickle. Then to a handful, then, finally, to a single group of 41 elderly Saranai who had chosen, in the end, to leave together. Among them was Ilith Corvin, the farmer who had waited longest of all, his small wooden box of photographs still held tightly against his chest. "Ambassador," Akafer said quietly, watching the group step one by one into the final transfer chamber. "How does it feel?" Thessaly Kor did not answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the world beyond the chamber's small viewport, at mountains and valleys and cities now empty, waiting in silence for something that could not be stopped, only outlived by the people who had once called it home. "It feels," she said finally, "like grief and gratitude occupying the same breath, Commander. I did not think that was possible until today." The last transfer from Old Sarin completed at 2:17 station time, 40 days and 2 hours after the crisis began. 99.6% of Old Sarin's population had been safely evacuated. The final 0.4% represented those who had chosen, freely and with full understanding, to remain. 6 hours later, the leading edge of the tide reached Old Sarin's outer atmosphere, and the world that Ambassador Thessaly Kor had called home, the world of 300 years of memory and cities that remembered wars they should have lost, began, slowly and silently, to disappear. Old Sarin's death took 11 hours. Naomi Reyes watched it from the operations center above Keithrani Hollow, where the last critical push of that world's evacuation was still underway. But she kept a secondary screen open the entire time, showing the long-range feed from an Etheri sensor platform trained on Old Sarin. She was not the only one watching. Across 3 worlds, in staging camps and orbital platforms and refugee shelters already filling with the displaced, millions of people who had once called that world home, or who had simply come to care about it over 40 desperate days, watched the same feed in silence. The tide did not arrive like fire or flood. It arrived like fading. The gray static crept across the planet's surface in slow, spreading patches, and wherever it touched, color and light simply stopped, not violently but completely, as though the world were a picture being erased one careful stroke at a time. Mountains vanished. Rivers vanished. Cities that Ambassador Thessaly Kor had once described as holding 300 years of memory folded into gray nothing. And then there was no city there at all. Not rubble, not ruin, simply absence. Elias Akafer stood beside Thessaly Kor on the observation deck of a Terran transport ship stationed at a safe distance, watching the feed alongside her rather than looking away, because she had asked him, quietly, not to leave her alone for this. "I always thought," she said, her voice very steady, very controlled in the particular way of someone holding themselves together through sheer will, "that if this day ever came I would be standing on the ground when it happened. That felt right once. Now I think I am glad I am not." "Why?" Akafer asked gently. "Because now when my people ask me what happened to Old Sarin," she said, "I do not have to tell them I watched it die alone with no one left beside me. I can tell them we watched it together, all of us, everyone who survived, safe somewhere else, grieving together instead of dying together. That is not the ending I once feared, Commander. It is not the ending I dared to hope for either. but it is one I believe I can live inside for as long as I have left to live. Old Saren finished disappearing at 13:48 station time. In the moment the feed finally showed nothing but gray static where a world had been. A silence fell across 3 worlds' worth of evacuation camps that no broadcast, no announcement, could adequately capture. Then slowly, in staging camps on Keithrani Hollow and orbital platforms above Vesa Prime, people who had never known a single Sarenai personally began to light small candles, or hold hands, or simply stand quietly together, honoring a world they had helped save 11 million lives from, even as they could not save the world itself. Keithrani Hollow was next, 6 days later. By then, the evacuation there was essentially complete. Of the original 2 billion Keithran, all but roughly 40,000 had been safely transferred. Most of that final gap made up not of failures in the system, but of a small, stubborn number of elderly miners who, much like Illith Corvin before them, chose in the end to remain with the world they had spent their lives carving a home from. Brana Talvek personally oversaw the final evacuation cycles, refusing to leave the operations center until the very last scheduled transfer had completed. And when it finally had, she sat down heavily in her chair and did not move for nearly 20 minutes, simply staring at the readouts that confirmed what 39 days of relentless, dangerous, imperfect work had actually accomplished. 98%, she said finally, to no one in particular, though Naomi Reyes was still in the room and heard her. 98% of 2 billion people, Dr. Reyes. I did not believe that number was possible the day you showed me your beautiful, wasteful arrays. Neither did I, Naomi admitted. I still don't fully believe it, even looking right at it. Vesa Prime, the largest and most populous of the 3 worlds, had the most time and the most people, and its evacuation stretched into its final week under conditions of both hope and exhaustion that Naomi Reyes would later describe, in a report to the Concord Council, as the hardest sustained effort she had ever been part of. By the final day, with the tide's leading edge visible even to the naked eye from orbit as a strange, light-swallowing smudge against the stars, the last transfer queues on Vesa Prime's surface stretched for kilometers, patient, quiet, disciplined in a way that reflected, Akafar thought, something essential about the Vesari people themselves. Speaker Doroth Khan insisted on remaining on the surface until nearly the very end, overseeing the final evacuation personally from a ground command post in what had once been the capital city, a curved, seashell-patterned metropolis now mostly empty, its streets echoing with nothing but wind and the distant hum of the last transfer chambers still operating. "High Speaker," Akafar said, arriving in person for the final hours, unwilling to let her face this alone any more than he had been willing to let Thessaly Kor watch old Saren's end without company. "We have room for you on the next transfer. You don't need to be the last one out." "I am the High Speaker of this council," Khan said, watching the final queue move steadily through the transfer chamber a short distance away. "I asked your species, 46 days ago, to choose one world to save, believing there was no other way. I think it is fitting that I am among the last to leave the world I was so certain we would have to abandon entirely." The final transfer from Vesa Prime's surface completed with just under 9 hours to spare before the tide's arrival, a number Naomi Reyes considered, privately, closer than she ever wanted evacuation margins to be again in her lifetime. Total evacuation across all 3 worlds, once every final count was tallied in the weeks that followed, came to just over 96.2% of the combined population of Vesa Prime, Keithrani Hollow, and Old Saren. More than 8 billion people, saved, out of an original population just over 8.5 billion, across a crisis that had begun with the Concord Council believing, with total certainty, that saving even one world in full would already be more than they could manage. 3 worlds died in the weeks that followed the final evacuations, exactly as the tide's own indifferent nature had always guaranteed they would. No power in the galaxy, human or otherwise, had ever found a way to stop the tide itself, and none would for a long time yet to come. Vesa Prime's seashell cities, Keithrani Hollow's carved mining halls, Old Saren's 300 years of memory, all of it, every physical trace of three civilizations' history, was consumed, exactly as feared from the very first emergency session in the council hall above Threnna Station. Earth, in the truest and most literal sense, had chosen to save no world at all. But in the refugee settlements that grew, in the months that followed, across a dozen systems throughout conquered space, something else had been saved that no amount of gray static could touch. Vesari children grew up in new cities, built with Kithran engineering and Terran design principles and Vesari architectural grace all woven together. Cities that its inhabitants began, within a generation, to call home in their own right. Kithran miners found new asteroid belts to carve their pride into, carrying forward traditions that had once seemed inseparable from the world that birthed them, proving they were not, in the end, only their world had ever been able to hold. And the Serenai, smallest and most fearful of losing everything a third time, found that their memory, the thing Ambassador Thessaly Core had once described as 300 years carried in stone and city, had never truly lived in the stone or the city at all. It had lived in them and they had carried it with them, whole, into whatever came next. At the next full session of the Concord Council, held 8 months after Old Saren's disappearance, High Speaker Doroth Can opened proceedings with words that would be remembered, quoted, and retold across conquered space for generations to come. 46 days ago, she said, standing once more in the council hall above Threnna Station, though this hall now held new faces, new delegates representing populations rebuilding in new homes across a dozen systems. This council asked a young, unproven species to choose one world to save, believing that was the only mercy available to us in an impossible situation. Humanity refused that choice. Not out of arrogance, though I confess, in that first session I believed it might be. Not out of naivety, though many of us feared with good reason that it was. Humanity refused because they looked at an impossible problem and decided that the shape of the problem itself was wrong, that the true value we needed to save was never the stone beneath our feet, but the people standing upon it. She paused, looking out over the assembled delegates, so many of whom now carried, in one way or another, the weight and the gratitude of that decision. They asked us to trust an experiment with no guarantee of success, built in 3 desperate days by a species we barely knew. We trusted them. It was not blind trust. Commander Akafer and Dr. Reyes earned it, hour by hour, failure by failure, correction by correction, alongside engineers and workers and volunteers from every species in this room who chose to build something impossible together rather than mourn something inevitable apart. 3 worlds are gone. That grief does not end today, and I do not ask it to. But 8 billion people are alive today who, by every calculation this council trusted 46 days ago, should not be. I do not know what to call what humanity did except this. They were asked to choose one world to save. They chose, instead, to save no world at all, and every single life the galaxy believed we were required to abandon. In the gallery above the council floor, watching quietly among a small group of dignitaries invited to observe the session, Elias Akafer stood beside Naomi Reyes, Amara Singh, Brana Talvek, Doran Vey, and Ambassador Thessaly Core. 6 people who had spent 46 days building something that had, in the end, redefined what an entire galaxy believed was possible when it came to mercy, and to sacrifice, and to the stubborn. Unglamorous work of simply refusing to accept an impossible choice as the only choice available. "You did good work, Commander," Thessaly Core said quietly, standing beside him as the council session continued below. "We did good work," Akafer corrected gently. "All of us. That was always the only way it could have worked." Below them, the council hall's dark glass floor still showed the stars beneath it, the way it always had, the same stars that had once looked down on 3 doomed worlds and now looked down on 8 billion survivors, scattered across a dozen new homes, carrying forward everything that had truly mattered all along. The worlds were gone, the people were not. That, in the end, was the choice humanity had made.